Hello, my name is Simmi Rana, and I'm a senior at the University of Kansas, double majoring in environmental studies and sociology with a minor in political science. I work at the Kansas Biological Survey, and I am mentored by Dr. Amy Bergen. This past summer, I carried out a research project called Groundwater Influence on Dissolved Gases in Intermittent Streams. For some background, climate change is increasingly causing stream drying, which has implications for stream functions, including the release of different gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, N2, and O2. Intermittent streams, or those that dry and re-wet, make up around 80% of all Kansas streams. Especially since intermittent streams connect to larger bodies of water like rivers, including the Kansas River, it's really important to study them for their effects on drinking water quality. An example of an interesting pattern previously observed in intermittent streams is the simultaneous high concentrations of O2 produced through photosynthesis and N2 produced in anoxic environments through denitrification. My research then compared surface to groundwater concentrations of the gases I previously listed and evaluated whether surface water concentrations were being influenced by groundwater inputs. I also looked at differences between dissolved gases in low flow versus high flow conditions. Our sample collection included 7 sites at Youngmeyer Ranch and 7 sites at Konza Prairie Biological Station. We sampled surface and groundwater, and the groundwater samples were collected from piezometers using a 2-meter syringe extender to minimize exposure to the atmosphere. You can see pictures of that fieldwork over here, and then there's also pictures of 2 field sites. This one is at Konza, and this one is at Youngmeyer. For the data that compared N2 and O2, I calculated N2 and O2 excess, which is a measure of how different the concentrations are from atmospheric equilibrium. In other words, how different are the actual concentrations from if the N2 and O2 concentrations in the stream were dependent solely on stream temperature and atmospheric pressure. The first figure on my poster shows 4 maps of Youngmeyer Ranch, comparing dissolved N2 excess in surface water versus groundwater in June versus July. From June to July, surface water had a shift from net denitrification to net nitrogen fixation. Groundwater in June had net denitrification conditions, and the values got further away from atmospheric equilibrium in July, and equilibrium would be 0% on the scale. Figure 2 on the poster shows 4 maps of Konza Prairie comparing dissolved nitrogen to dissolved oxygen in June only, both in surface water and groundwater. Dissolved N2 concentrations were pretty similar between surface and groundwater. However, oxygen concentrations were much further away with equilibrium, with more respiration in ground than surface water, including at the site O2MO2, which is that blue dot right there. So that one had very high net photosynthetic conditions in surface water, but then had very high net respiration conditions in groundwater, which is very interesting. Because stream and groundwater concentrations were similar in many cases, in-stream concentrations may be influenced by groundwater inputs. This may explain the simultaneous presence of O2 and N2 observed in previous studies. Additionally, O2 and N2 concentrations were differently affected at both the prairie systems, showing that there may be other variables at play, such as dissolved carbon. Lastly, although the samples were collected from a depth of 2 meters, the stark contrast between the excess values in surface water versus groundwater for all Youngmeyer sites in July, and also the O2MO2 values that we found for surface water versus groundwater for oxygen, show that the values we found may still be representative of the relative differences we might see in intermittent stream, surface water, and groundwater. My next step for this research project is to analyze the other half of my data, which will provide more information on the exchange between surface and groundwater, specifically with greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And also, for a more accurate understanding of this relationship, future sampling efforts should focus on the deep wells at Konza Prairie rather than the piezometers to retrieve true groundwater samples. I'd like to thank all of the collaborators that helped me in both lab and fieldwork, including but not limited to Dr. Bergen and Casey Zarek, and also thank you for listening to this presentation.